No, no, not this one. Grace!
Daniel, leave it. Leave the wood. Come out.
This is everything, Grace. This is all of it.
We'll rebuild it. We always rebuild it.
With what?
Mommy, my chest hurts again.
Michael.
He's burning up. Grace, the clinic. We need the clinic.
We don't have it, Daniel. We don't have the money.
Why? Why does an honest man work his whole life with his hands and still watch his son suffer? You are a skilled man. But skill alone will not make you wealthy.
Daniel said nothing. The man in the doorway did not move to leave. He simply waited, the way a man waits when he already knows the answer before the question has finished being asked. Daniel finally found his voice. "Who are you?" "Someone who noticed you," the stranger said. "My name is Victor." He stepped into the ruined workshop as if the collapsed roof, the soaked wood, the splintered cabinet meant nothing to him at all. His shoes did not sink into the mud, pooling across the floor. His clothes did not darken with the rain still dripping through the torn ceiling above him. He moved through the wreckage the way a man moves through a room he already owns, unhurried, entirely at ease. Daniel would remember that detail for the rest of his life. He simply didn't know it yet. Victor ran a hand along the broken edge of a table Daniel had spent 3 weeks building, sanded smooth, joints cut by hand, now split down the center where the roof had come down on it. "Fine work," he said. "Wasted. Now, I'll rebuild it." "With what?" The question landed the way a blade lands, quiet, and already inside you before you feel it. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. Victor let the silence sit for a long moment before speaking again, his voice unhurried, almost gentle, the voice of a man who had rehearsed patience until it no longer needed rehearsing. "There are other ways to become rich," he said. "Ways that don't depend on rain, or customers who forget to pay, or wood that rots in a storm before you can sell it. Ways that don't leave a man on his knees in the mud, salvaging what little remains of a life that was never going to be enough, no matter how hard he worked at it." Daniel had heard words like these before. Every town had a story like this one, whispered over cups of palm wine, told with lowered voices and glances over the shoulder. A neighbor who grew wealthy overnight, his fortunes changing in a single season. A businessman whose success no one could ever fully explain, no matter how closely they looked into it. Rumors of secret rituals, sacrifices offered in silence, in places decent people did not go. Bargains struck in the dark, and never spoken of again by the men who struck them. He had always told himself he would never be foolish enough to listen to such things, no matter how bad his luck turned. "I'm not interested," Daniel said. Victor only smiled, the same faint, unhurried smile that never seemed to reach anywhere else on his face, as though it lived there alone, separate from whatever he was actually feeling underneath it. "You don't have to decide today." He said it the way another man might comment on the weather. No pressure behind it, no urgency, as though the offer would simply sit there in the air of the workshop indefinitely, waiting for Daniel to walk past it enough times that it stopped looking strange to him. Daniel studied the stranger's face for anything that might explain him. A scar, a tell, some small human imperfection that would make the man in front of him easier to place, easier to dismiss. He found nothing. Victor's face gave away exactly as much as he intended it to, not a fraction more. "I don't even know what you're offering," Daniel said finally, hating himself a little for asking at all, for giving the question room to exist between them instead of shutting the door on it outright. "Not yet," Victor agreed, "but you will, when you're ready to hear it properly." Men rarely are, the first time. And then he turned and walked out into the night, and the storm that had refused to touch him closed silently behind him, swallowing the sound of his footsteps almost instantly, as if the darkness itself had been waiting to take him back. Daniel stood alone in his broken workshop for a long time, water dripping steadily around him, the wind finally beginning to die down outside. He told himself it was nothing, a strange man, a strange offer, and nothing more than that. He had work to do, a roof to patch, tools to salvage, a family waiting for him at home who needed him whole, not shaken by the words of some passing stranger. But the idea had already found a way inside him, the way smoke finds its way through the smallest gap beneath a door, and ideas like that do not leave quietly once they've settled somewhere warm. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Daniel's life. He went from house to house, workshop to workshop, asking for work, asking for loans, asking for anything at all that might buy his family a little more time. Some doors opened, most did not. Some men who had once called him friend now found reasons not to meet his eyes when he passed. He borrowed from his cousin in the next town, a man who counted out the notes slowly, reluctantly, already worried aloud about when, or whether, he would ever see them again. He borrowed from Emeka, an old friend from childhood who could barely spare it himself, and who pressed the money into Daniel's hand without a word, unable to look at him while he did it, as though ashamed on Daniel's behalf. He went to Mr. Bankole, a moneylender, known throughout the district for a patience that ran thin fast, and signed his name to a debt he did not know how he would ever repay, the older man's eyes cold and businesslike the entire time. He sold 2 of his best chisels, the ones his own father had given him, worn smooth by decades of careful use, to a trader in the market, who examined them for a long moment, named a price Daniel knew was less than half their worth, and paid it anyway, because Daniel had no room left in him to argue. He went to old Mama Adaize, who ran the provision store on the corner, and had known Daniel since he was a boy delivering firewood for pocket change. She counted out what little she could spare from the small tin box beneath her counter, pressing it into his palm with both of her hands, folding his fingers closed around it. "Pay me back whenever God provides," she told him, not before. He went to the church, where the pastor prayed over him at length and offered what the congregation's welfare basket could give, which was food enough for a week, not medicine enough for a month. He went to a former customer, a government clerk who had once paid Daniel handsomely for a set of cabinets, and who now looked at him with the particular discomfort of a man watching someone else's misfortune up close, and quietly thanking God it wasn't his own turn. He even swallowed his pride and went to Chief Adewale, the wealthiest landowner in the district, a man who had once turned down Daniel's own father for a loan decades earlier, and never let anyone forget he'd been right to do so. The chief listened to Daniel's request from behind a wide mahogany desk, tapping his fingers slowly against the wood, and finally offered a sum so small it felt less like help than like a reminder of exactly where Daniel stood in the world. "Times are hard for everyone," the chief said, not quite meeting his eyes. "You understand." Daniel understood. He thanked the man anyway, because pride was a luxury he could no longer afford, and walked the long road home, turning the insult over and over in his mind, until it stopped feeling sharp, and simply felt heavy instead. He tried the bank in the next town as well, filling out forms in careful handwriting, waiting 3 hours on a hard bench, only to be told, politely, that a man with no collateral and no steady income was not a man the bank could risk lending to, storm or no storm. Grace, without telling him at first, began taking in laundry from 3 families on their street, scrubbing clothes by hand late into the night, after Michael had finally settled, her knuckles raw by morning, her back aching in a way she hid well enough that Daniel didn't notice for almost a week. When he found out, he tried to make her stop, ashamed that his wife had to carry this too, but she only shook her head and kept scrubbing. "We're in this together," she told him, not looking up from the basin. "You don't get to carry it alone just because you feel you should." Their neighbor, a widow named Comfort who lived 2 doors down, began quietly leaving small parcels of food on their step some mornings. A few yams, a handful of dried fish, never announcing it, never asking to be thanked, simply doing what she could for a family she'd watched struggling through her window. Daniel found out it was her, only by accident, catching her setting the parcel down one dawn, and the 2 of them stood there a moment in silence, neither quite willing to make it a bigger thing than it already was. "Your father helped bury my husband all those years ago, and never once let me pay him for the coffin," Comfort said finally, when the silence stretched too long to leave unfilled. "I haven't forgotten it. Some debts, you don't wait to be asked to repay." She patted his arm once and walked back toward her own gate before he could find the words to thank her properly, leaving him standing there with the small parcel in his hands and an ache in his chest he hadn't expected. Word travels fast in a small town, and it did not take long for people to begin talking. Daniel caught the whispers sometimes, walking past the market stalls, a lowered voice here, a glance exchanged there, conversations that stopped a half-second too late as he came within earshot. On market day, Daniel laid out the last of what he owned on a threadbare cloth at the edge of the square. A hand plane, a set of carving knives, a small radio Grace had been given as a wedding gift. He sat behind them through the heat of the afternoon, watching neighbors he had known his whole life walk past without stopping, or stop only long enough to offer a price that insulted the years of work behind each tool. By evening, he had sold almost everything, and counted the notes twice with trembling hands, already knowing before he finished counting that it still would not be enough to cover what the week ahead would demand of him. He walked home in the dark that night carrying an empty cloth where his tools had been, and for the first time in his life, Daniel understood what it meant to feel his own hands were worthless, not because they lacked skill, but because the world around him had simply run out of ways to pay for what they could do. Still, it was not enough. None of the borrowing, none of the selling, none of it changed the numbers waiting for him at home each evening. It was never quite enough, and the gap between what he had and what his family needed only seemed to widen, no matter how many doors he knocked on. Michael's fever came and went, but never fully left him. Some mornings the boy woke laughing, chasing the neighbor's dog around the compound, his small wooden toy clutched tightly in one hand, the animal Daniel had carved for him one slow evening years before, worn smooth now from constant handling. Other mornings he couldn't rise from the mat at all, his breath shallow and fast, his small body burning with a heat that no cool cloth seemed able to touch for more than a few minutes at a time. Grace sat beside him through the worst of those nights, pressing a damp rag to his forehead, whispering the same songs their own mothers had once sung to them both, her voice steady even when her hands were not. Daniel watched from the doorway, useless, his hands, his skilled, capable hands, hands that could turn raw timber into anything a person could imagine, unable to fix the one thing that mattered more than all of it combined. Old Baba Tunde, who had outlived 3 wives and claimed to remember every strange happening the town had seen in 60 years, stopped Daniel one afternoon outside the market, gripping his arm with surprising strength for a man his age. "They say a stranger has been seen near your workshop," the old man said, his voice low, glancing once over his own shoulder before continuing. "A tall man, fine clothes, never sweats, they say, even at midday, even walking the same dusty road the rest of us are choking on." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "I don't know what you mean." Baba Tunde studied him for a long moment, the way old men study things they have seen before and had hoped never to see again in their lifetime. There are men like that, he said finally, who come to towns like ours only when someone is desperate enough to listen to them. I buried a friend once who listened to a man just like the one they're describing. He got everything he ever wanted. Carpenter. Everything. Then, in the end, he lost everything that had ever actually mattered to him. He released Daniel's arms slowly. Whatever you're thinking of doing, don't. I am telling you this because your father would have wanted someone to tell you. Daniel walked away without answering, the old man's warning trailing after him like smoke he couldn't quite outrun, no matter how fast he walked. At home that evening, he found Michael sitting up on his mat, weak but awake, watching his father with the unclouded honesty only a sick child seems to carry. "Daddy, why do you look so sad all the time now?" Daniel forced a smile onto his face and sat beside him. "I'm not sad. I'm just thinking. About the money?" The question caught Daniel off guard. He hadn't realized how much the boy understood, how much he had absorbed lying quietly on his mat while the adults around him whispered about debts and clinics and things they thought he was too young to follow. "Don't worry about the money," Daniel told him, smoothing the boy's damp hair back from his forehead. "That's my job to worry about. Yours is just to get strong again." Michael nodded slowly, already half asleep again, his small hand still curled around his wooden toy even in sleep, and Daniel sat beside him a long while after his breathing had evened out, watching him, memorizing the shape of his face in the lamplight, the way a man memorizes something he's afraid he might lose. That night, sitting beside Michael's mat long after Grace had finally fallen asleep from exhaustion, Daniel pressed his forehead against his son's small damp one and made a promise he had no way yet of knowing how he would keep. "I won't let anything happen to you," he whispered. "Whatever it takes, I promise you that." Michael, half asleep, only murmured something unintelligible and curled tighter around his wooden toy. The following week, Grace's own mother came to visit from the next village over, taking one look at her grandson's thin, feverish face, before pulling Grace aside into the yard, out of Daniel's hearing. "This is not an ordinary sickness that lingers this long," the older woman said, her voice tight with worry. "You should take him to see someone who understands these things. A sickness that refuses medicine sometimes has a cause medicine cannot touch." Grace didn't answer. She didn't want to believe her own mother might be right, and she didn't want to think too hard about what someone who understands these things might actually mean, or where such a search might eventually lead a desperate family. When she told Daniel about it later that night, half expecting him to dismiss it as superstition, the way he always had, he only nodded slowly and said nothing at all, his eyes fixed somewhere far away from the room they were standing in. They tried the clinic a second time that week, arriving before dawn to be first in line, Michael wrapped in a blanket against the early chill, his small body shivering despite the heat rolling off his skin. The nurse who eventually saw them was kinder than the one before, examining the boy carefully, listening to his chest, frowning in a way that made Grace's stomach drop before the woman had even spoken. "He needs proper tests," the nurse said quietly, pulling Grace aside so Michael wouldn't hear. "Blood work, at minimum, possibly more, depending on what it shows. I can't tell you what this is from a look and a listen alone, and I won't pretend to. And if we can't pay for the tests?" The nurse's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. They walked home that morning with nothing but a small packet of fever reducers, purchased with money meant for the following week's food, and a fear neither of them said aloud the entire walk back. One evening, nearly a month after the storm, Daniel returned to his half-repaired workshop, the new roof still incomplete overhead, to find Victor already there, seated calmly on an overturned crate, as though he had been personally invited to wait there for as long as necessary. "You came back," Daniel said. "I never left, Carpenter. I simply waited for you to be ready to talk properly." Daniel wanted to order him out. He wanted to tell him never to return, to take his calm voice and his unbothered clothes and his impossible, unnatural stillness and leave for good. Instead, against every instinct that had carried him through an honest life until now, he lowered himself onto a stool across from the man and sat. "Tell me what you mean," Daniel said quietly. "Tell me exactly what you mean. all of it, and don't soften any part of it for me." Victor's smile widened, just slightly, the smile of a man who had done this before, many times, in many workshops, in many homes just like this one across many years, and knew precisely how the conversation would go from here, because it always went the same way in the end. "There is a way," he said, "to change everything, and quickly. Your debts, gone by morning, every note torn up, every man you owe, suddenly satisfied, your son's health, restored beyond anything a clinic in this town could ever offer him, the roof over your family's head, replaced with something far greater than this small workshop, this small house, this small life. All of it, more than you have ever dared to imagine having, even in your best dreams. And the price? There is always a price," Victor said. "That is the part desperate men prefer to forget, right up until the very moment it comes due." "Why me?" Daniel asked instead, before Victor could continue. "There are other men in this town in worse trouble than I am. Why come to my workshop and not theirs?" Victor considered the question for a moment, as though he found it genuinely interesting, a rare thing from a man who otherwise seemed to have every answer prepared in advance. "Not every man is willing to look at what he's afraid of," he said finally. "You are. I saw it the first night, in the way you stood in the ruins of everything you'd built, and didn't look away from it. Most men look away, Carpenter. That is usually the difference." Daniel turned the answer over in his mind, unsure whether it was meant as a compliment or a diagnosis. Unsure, in truth, whether there was any real difference between the two where Victor was concerned. "Tell me the price. All of it." Victor leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, though there was no one else within miles who could have overheard them in that ruined little building. "Something precious," he said. "Something given in return, when the time is right, and not a moment before. That is all I can tell you tonight, Carpenter. The rest reveals itself only to those who are ready to walk further than words." Something cold settled in Daniel's chest, spreading slowly, the way water finds every low place in a room it's flooding. "No," he said, standing so fast the stool scraped hard against the floor behind him. "No, I won't do it. Whatever it is you're offering, I won't do it." Victor did not argue. He never argued. Daniel would come to understand, in time, that arguing was beneath a man like him, that he had never once needed to raise his voice to get exactly what he'd come for. He simply rose, straightened his immaculate jacket with 2 unhurried motions, and walked toward the door. "You don't have to decide today," he said again, the same words as before, as if he had all the time that had ever existed, and none of it mattered to him either way. "But your son is still sick, Carpenter. And sickness does not wait politely for a man to find his courage, or his pride, or whatever it is you're calling it tonight." He left Daniel standing alone in the half-dark, those words hanging in the still air, long after the sound of his footsteps had faded out into the night. Daniel stood there for a long time afterward, replaying the exchange in his mind, the calm certainty in Victor's voice, the way he'd said something precious, as though the phrase cost him nothing at all to say, as though he had said it 100 times before, to 100 other desperate men, in 100 other broken workshops, just like this one. He tried to imagine what such a price could possibly mean: a ring, perhaps, a name given up, a year shaved off his own life somewhere down the line, the way the old folk tales sometimes told it. He built explanation after explanation in his mind that night, each one a little more forgiving than the last, each one a small brick laid down in the wall he was building between himself and the truth he didn't yet want to see. It would be a long time before he understood that the answer had been sitting in front of him the entire evening, plain and unhidden, and that he simply hadn't wanted to hear it. That night, Daniel could not sleep. He lay beside Grace, staring up at the cracked ceiling above their bed, listening to Michael's uneven breathing through the thin wall between their rooms. In and out and in again, each breath a small, fragile victory Daniel had no way of guaranteeing would continue past sunrise. He thought about the years he had spent bent over a workbench, turning raw wood into something beautiful, something useful, something honest. And how none of it, none of his skill, none of his sweat, none of his integrity, had been enough in the end to keep his son safe from something as ordinary as a fever. He thought about the promise he had made to Grace on the morning they married, standing outside her family's compound in his one good shirt, swearing to her family and to her that he would give her a good life, that he would never let his family go without. He thought about the small wooden toy Michael carried with him everywhere, a carved little animal, rough at the edges but loved beyond measure, because his father had made it for him with his own 2 hands, on a quiet evening when they'd had nothing else in the world to give each other but time. And slowly, terribly, he began to convince himself. Perhaps it wasn't as dark as it sounded. Perhaps something precious meant nothing more than an offering, a token, a symbolic gesture, the kind of small sacrifice every tradition asked of its followers, in one form or another, harmless in the end. Perhaps the old stories he'd grown up hearing were exaggerated, the way frightening stories always seemed to grow larger and darker with every retelling around a fire. Perhaps, he told himself, lying awake in the dark beside the woman he loved, there was a version of this where his family received everything they needed, and no one truly paid the cost of it. Perhaps he could be the exception every desperate man believes himself to be. He wanted so badly to believe that. Wanting, he would learn far too late, is a dangerous kind of proof. He remembered, too, a story his own mother used to tell him as a boy, about a fisherman who traded his shadow to the river spirits for a boat that never came home empty. The story had always ended the same way when she told it. The fisherman grew rich and fat and comfortable, and one day simply forgot he had ever had a shadow to lose. As a child, Daniel had thought it a strange, pointless story, the kind adults told to fill an evening. Lying awake now, decades later, he understood for the first time that his mother had never meant it as entertainment at all. She had meant it as a warning, delivered early enough that he might still remember it when the moment came. He remembered it. He simply chose, that night, not to let it stop him, telling himself one final time that his story would somehow end differently than the fisherman's had. The way every desperate man tells himself his story will be the exception before he ever finds out for certain whether it is. The next morning, Grace found him sitting outside on the step, staring at nothing, the same way he had the night the stranger first appeared in his workshop doorway. "You've been different," she said, lowering herself beside him. "Since the storm, since, I don't know what, exactly. Something." "I'm just tired," Daniel said. "Tired, I understand," Grace said, taking his rough hand in both of hers. "This is something else, Daniel. I have known you 12 years. I know the difference between tired and whatever this is," he almost told her. The words rose in his throat, ready to leave him. Victor, the offer, the price he still didn't fully understand and had spent every night since trying not to think about. But he looked at her, at the exhaustion already carved deep into her face from worrying over Michael, from worrying over money, from worrying now over him, and he could not bring himself to hand her one more burden to carry on top of everything she was already holding without complaint. "I'm going to fix this," he said instead. "I promise you, I'm going to fix all of it, Grace. Soon, I promise." Grace studied his face for a long, quiet moment, and something in her eyes told him she did not fully believe him. But she did not press further. She simply nodded and rested her head against his shoulder, and for a few minutes they sat together in the fragile, borrowed quiet of a life that was still, barely, intact. Daniel would hold on to that moment for a long time afterward. He would need it, later, more than he could have known while it was happening. In the days that followed, he tried, in small ways, to talk himself out of what he already knew he was going to do. He threw himself into repairing the workshop roof, hammering sheet after sheet of tin into place until his arms burned and his hands blistered, as though physical exhaustion alone could crowd out the thought waiting patiently for him at the edge of every quiet moment. He walked past the tree line twice that week without stopping, telling himself both times that he was simply out for air, that the forest held no particular pull for him, that he was not, in fact, circling closer to a decision he had already made, somewhere beneath the surface of his own mind. He prayed too, more than he had in years, kneeling beside his bed after Grace had fallen asleep, whispering into the dark for some sign, some alternative, some door he hadn't yet tried. No answer came that felt any different from the silence that had already surrounded his family for weeks. And silence, to a desperate man listening hard enough for permission, can start to sound like nothing standing in his way. 3 days passed. Michael's fever spiked again, worse than it had ever been, his small body shaking, his lips cracked and dry, his eyes struggling to focus on his mother's face bent low over him in the lamplight. The local clinic turned them away without payment in hand, the nurse apologetic but unmoving, rules being rules whether or not a child was suffering behind them. Grace wept that night in a way Daniel had never once seen her weep. Not loudly, not for show, but quietly, exhausted, as though something deep inside her was finally giving way under a weight she had been carrying without complaint for far too long. "I keep asking God why," she whispered against his chest, "and I don't hear anything back. Just silence, Daniel. Just Michael getting worse and worse, and nobody answering me." Daniel had no answer for her either. He held her instead, because it was the only thing left he had to give that hadn't already been sold, borrowed against, or worn down to nothing. Then he rose, once Grace had finally cried herself into an uneasy sleep, dressed in the dark, and walked back to his workshop alone, the night air cold and sharp against his skin, the town silent around him. Victor was already there, seated on the same crate as before, as though he had known Daniel would come, as though he always knew, as though this entire month of borrowing and selling and begging and praying had simply been the necessary distance a man needed to walk before arriving at the only door that had ever truly stayed open to him. "I'm ready," Daniel said, before he could stop himself, before he could think better of it, before the last honest part of him could pull him back one final time from the edge he was standing on. "Tell me what I have to do." Victor's expression did not change. There was no triumph in it, no cruelty, no hunger, only the same calm, patient stillness he had carried since the moment he first stepped through that broken doorway weeks ago. The stillness, Daniel would come to understand far too late, of a man who was never in a hurry, because for him, the outcome had never once been in doubt. "Good," Victor said softly. "Then walk with me." He turned toward the tree line at the edge of town, where the forest grew dense and old, where no path had been cleared in generations, where the town's oldest residents warned their grandchildren, half joking and half not, never to wander after the sun went down. Daniel hesitated only a moment, glancing back once toward the small house where his wife and son were sleeping, unaware of the choice being made a few hundred meters away that would reshape the rest of their lives, for better or for worse. Then he stepped forward, past the wood he could no longer save, past the modest, honest workshop he had built with nothing but patience and his own 2 hands, and followed the stranger into the dark. The town's lights grew smaller behind him with every step, until they were nothing more than a faint, flickering glow he could still feel more than see through the trees. Ahead of him, the forest opened like a mouth, the air growing colder with each step, the ground growing softer beneath his sandals, mist curling low and thick around the roots of trees far older than the town itself, older, perhaps, than any name the town had ever carried. Victor walked without hesitation, without once looking back to check that Daniel was still following, as though the darkness held no unfamiliar turns for him at all, as though he had walked this exact path more times than Daniel could begin to imagine. Branches closed overhead, blotting out what little moonlight had followed them this far. Somewhere in the distance, an animal called once and went silent, as if it too understood not to interrupt whatever was about to happen beneath these trees. "How much further?" Daniel asked, his voice smaller than he intended it to sound in the thickening dark. "As far as it takes," Victor said, without slowing, without turning his head. you'll find that distance means very little to the kind of thing we're walking toward. And after tonight, will I remember any of this? Victor allowed himself something close to a laugh, quiet and dry, a sound with no real warmth inside it. You will remember all of it, Carpenter. Every step. That is the part men never expect. They imagine forgetting would be a mercy. It is not the mercy you're given. Daniel said nothing more after that. The mist grew thicker around his ankles with every step, cold enough now that he could see his own breath in front of him, despite the warmth of the season, as though the forest itself had its own private, unnatural weather, the closer they drew toward its center. He thought, once, of turning back, of simply stopping where he stood and walking home in the dark, waking Grace, telling her everything, letting her decide together with him what kind of man he was going to be. The thought lasted only a moment before Michael's fevered face rose up behind his eyes again, and his feet kept moving forward without his permission. The forest floor began to slope downward, gently at first, then more steeply, until Daniel found himself half sliding on damp leaves and loose earth, catching himself against tree trunks that felt colder to the touch than the night air alone could explain. Victor moved down the same slope without any visible effort, his pace never changing, his footing never once uncertain, as though the ground itself had agreed long ago never to trouble him. Somewhere off to their left, Daniel heard what might have been water, a stream, or something like one, though the sound had a strange, hollow quality to it, less like liquid moving over stone and more like something breathing slowly in the dark. He didn't ask what it was. Some part of him had already decided he did not want to know the answer to every question this forest might raise before the night was through. "You've done this before," Daniel said, more statement than question, needing to fill the silence with something other than his own thoughts. "Brought men here." "Many times," Victor said simply, without turning. "You are neither the first, nor, I expect, will you be the last. And the others, what happened to them?" Victor was quiet long enough that Daniel began to think he wouldn't answer at all. "Some of them are wealthier today than you can imagine," he said finally, "living lives most men would trade everything to have. Others," he paused, choosing his next words with unusual care, "others learned what the price actually meant, once it came due. That part of the story is never mine to tell in advance, Carpenter. It belongs to the man who agrees to pay it." Daniel's heart pounded harder with every step, some last, buried part of him screaming to turn back even now, even this close, even after everything that had brought him here. But he thought of Michael's small, burning face, and he kept walking. The trees around them grew wider, older, their trunks twisted into shapes that seemed less like anything natural and more like something frozen mid-motion, caught reaching for one another across the narrowing path. Roots rose up out of the ground like knuckles, forcing Daniel to watch his footing, even as he tried to keep pace with Victor's unbothered stride ahead of him. Somewhere behind his ribs, a small, steady voice he did not recognize as fully his own kept asking the same question over and over, quiet beneath the pounding of his heart. What am I about to become? He had no answer for it. He wasn't sure, walking deeper into a darkness that seemed to be thickening with every step, that he wanted one yet. And somewhere ahead, beneath an ancient tree that had stood long before Daniel's grandfather was born, long before the town had a name, long before any of the debts or the storms or the desperate nights that had led him here, something was already waiting, patiently, for him to arrive. The path narrowed further still, until it was barely wide enough for one man to pass through without brushing against the trees on either side, their bark cold and rough beneath his fingertips when he reached out once to steady himself. He could no longer hear anything from the town behind him, no dogs, no distant voices, no rooster mistaking moonlight for morning, only the soft, wet sound of his own footsteps, and Victor's, moving steadily ahead of him without ever once slowing to check that he was still there. At one point, the ground dipped sharply and Daniel stumbled, catching himself against a low branch. Victor did not turn around. "You'll want your footing steady from here," he said simply, not unkindly, the way a man might warn a guest about an uneven step in his own home. What lies ahead does not forgive carelessness. Daniel said nothing. He straightened, wiped his palm against his trousers, and kept walking, the mist now rising almost to his knees, cold enough that it seemed to seep through the fabric and settle directly into his bones. He thought, briefly, of his father, a man he had lost young, a man who had taught him everything he knew about wood and patience, and the particular dignity of building something with your own two hands. He wondered, walking deeper into a darkness his father had surely warned him about once, in some half-remembered lesson from childhood, whether the old man would recognize the son walking this path tonight. He decided he did not want to know the answer to that question either, and pushed the thought away, the way he had pushed away so many other thoughts these past weeks, each one a small door, closing quietly behind him. The trees thinned without warning, opening into a wide clearing bathed in a moonlight that seemed too bright, too silver, too still to belong to the same sky Daniel had walked beneath his entire life. At the center of it stood the tree Victor had spoken of only in passing until now, vast beyond anything Daniel had seen in the forests around his town, its trunk wider than his own house, its roots breaking up through the earth in thick, gnarled ridges that spread outward in every direction, like something alive and patient, something that had been waiting here long enough to stop counting the years. Victor stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to face him fully for the first time since they had entered the forest. "This is as far as words carry you, Carpenter," he said. "Everything past this point, you'll understand only by choosing it." Daniel stood at the tree line, his chest tight, his legs suddenly unwilling to carry him the final steps forward. Behind him lay the path back to the town, back to Grace, back to the small, honest life he had built with nothing but patience and calloused hands. Ahead of him lay something he had no name for yet, something that had been waiting, he now understood, far longer than he had. He thought of Michael's breathing through the thin wall between their rooms. He thought of Grace's face in the lamplight, exhausted and still, somehow, full of a faith in him he wasn't certain he deserved anymore. Then Daniel stepped forward into the clearing, toward the ancient tree, and toward whatever was waiting patiently beneath it for him to finally arrive, carrying with him every debt, every sleepless night, every promise made in the dark to a wife and son who had no idea what he was about to trade for their survival.